Hi, everyone. Welcome in. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Thank you for joining us today. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Owens. I am a specialist with the UC Davis Resource Center for Family Focused Practice, and I am thrilled to be here with you all this morning. Thank you for joining us for our September Complex Care webinar. As folks are joining the call and getting connected to their audio, I'm going to go ahead and say, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, share who you are and what county or agency you represent. We would love to hear from you. We always enjoy knowing who's in the audience with us. And as always, if you see a friend or a colleague in the audience, please reach out and say hello. All right, cool. We see some responses coming in the chat. We have LA County, some Orange County folks, Riverside. Welcome, everyone. Glad to see so many of you here with us today joining the call. Okay. So once again, as folks are joining, I'm going to go ahead and ask an icebreaker question for everyone. So we are in mid-September right now, and the autumn equinox is right around the corner. So I am curious, what fall activity is everyone looking forward to? So, icebreaker question for those of you who are just joining. What fall activity are you most looking forward to? I will share with you what mine is. I am going to a conference in the beginning of October in Virginia. And for some reason, I thought the conference was in Vermont. And those are different places, but I was excited about the prospect of going to Vermont because I'm really looking forward to all of the fall beautiful colors. So that's what I'm looking forward to most. So I see some comments in the chat, the cooler weather. It's going to be 98 where I live right now. It doesn't feel very much like fall. Baking, Halloween, pumpkin carving. I saw someone wrote apple picking. That sounds wonderful. Roasting marshmallows, lots of pumpkin patch goers. That also sounds like fun. Great. Keep the responses coming in the chat. It's great to hear from you. Certainly looking forward to the cooler sweater weather and boot season as well. Well, thank you all for playing along and participating. Once again, for those of you who are just joining the call, my name is Jessica Owens. I'm a specialist with the UC Davis Resource Center for Family Focused Practice. And you are here for our September Complex Care webinar. And this webinar is brought to you in partnership between the UC Davis Resource Center for Family Focused Practice and the California Department of Social Services. I do have a few housekeeping items for you all before we get started. I do have a few of my UC Davis colleagues in the audience with me today. We have James Williams and Lizzie Dambose. So if the three of us will be monitoring the chat. If any questions or comments come up, we're going to ask you all to hold those until the end, and we will answer questions and comments then. But please, as they come up or you're curious, you can always post them in the chat. Just so you all know, today's presentation is being recorded. The recording of the webinar as well as the PowerPoint will be posted on our Complex Care website. I'm going to put the link for you in the chat now. You can access all of our previous Complex Care webinars as well as register for upcoming webinars through that link. I'm checking my notes here. Okay, if you are interested in requesting a letter of attendance for today's webinar, you can also make that request using this link. And I also wanted to let you all know that UC Davis is offering child-specific complex care coaching. These sessions can be useful when every option feels exhausted. These sessions help teams identify new ways forward and remember there is hope for every youth whose life you touch. Complex care coaching sessions can help teams step back, re energize, and reimagine a path forward. We are hosting these child specific complex care coaching sessions on specific days. So there's a little bit more information about the times that are available. However, if those times don't work out for your schedule, you can also send us a request through this link. So wanted to make sure you all had that information before we get started. So at this point, we would like to know a little bit more about who is making up our audience. So we are going to ask a polling question so we have an idea about who's here before we get started with our presentation. So I'm going to lean into my colleague James. Can you go ahead and drop that poll for the audience? Thanks, James. Awesome. Thank you all for taking a moment to complete that poll. Be super helpful. All right, you guys are doing great. We have about half of you have completed the poll already, and we'll keep it open for about 30 more seconds. All right, about 10 more seconds. We almost have everyone completed. Thank you all for filling that out for us. All right, awesome. Okay, James, let's go ahead and close it out. And if we can, share the results. Thanks, James. So as you can see, about 58% of our audience is made up of a county child welfare, probation, or other county departments. We have about 8% state departments in our audience. We have 25% community-based organizations. We always love to see our partners in the audience with us as well. We have a tribal organization represented. So great to have a diverse audience. And for those of you who marked other, you can feel free to share in the chat what kind of organization you might be coming from. We definitely want to capture all of the organizations who attend our webinars. Okay, James, with that, let's go ahead and drop the next poll, please. All right, so this question is more asking about what is your specific role within your organization? Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, everyone. You all are doing great. I see the responses coming in very quickly. All right, cool. We have quite a few of you. We're almost capturing everyone in the audience. So we're going to keep it open for about 20 more seconds. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for taking a moment to fill that out. And James, I think we can go ahead and close it. And we'll share those results with you all. So it looks like about 48% is in a leadership or admin role. 29% are therapists or clinicians. We have 29% social workers, a few case managers. We have a couple parent partners in the room with us. And awesome. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for completing that. That will be helpful as we move forward. Our presenters know exactly who they're talking to. Okay, James, let's go ahead and close that out. So once again, if you all are just joining us, you're here for the September Complex Care webinar. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, share what county or agency you represent. And I'm going to go ahead and kick us off now. So when the term complex care is used, it is intended to highlight circumstances in which youth have a variety of identified needs across multiple domains. These needs have been unmet, often over long periods of time, by behavioral health, child welfare, probation, education, and other systems. As a result, these youth need high-intensity, individualized treatment options to better resolve challenges and address their needs. By integrating services from multiple systems and tailoring interventions to the specific needs of each youth, we are better able to provide comprehensive support and facilitate meaningful improvements in their lives. Today's webinar is titled A Biologically Respectful Approach to Treating Children, Implementation of NMT in California Public Systems. The neurosequential model is not a specific therapeutic technique or intervention. It is a way to organize a child's history and current functioning. The goal of this approach is to structure assessment of a child, the articulation of the primary problems, identification of key strengths, and the application of interventions, including educational, enrichment, and therapeutic strategies that aim to support the family, educators, therapists, and other related professionals to best meet the needs of the child. So today's presentation has a few presenters that will be presenting today. So just to give you a quick overview of who we have in the room, we have folks joining us from Fresno County, San Mateo, and Santa Clara. And we also have our UC Davis consultant, NMT consultant, Tony DeMarco in the room with us. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Tony first, and then we're going to pass the baton over to her. So Tony has worked for over 30 years in the public and nonprofit sectors as a clinician, supervisor, manager, and educator, with a specific focus on trauma and its generational impact on families and children. Tony is the retired deputy director for the San Mateo County Behavioral Health and Recovery Services Youth Division. Tony was the site coordinator for San Mateo County's NMT program, implementation and training program for a decade. She is a certified Phase 2 NMT trainer and mentor, working with the Neurosequential Network's training program, and currently is a consultant for the CDSS NMT Learning Collaborative project. She has spent her career working with issues of youth suicide, self-harm, trauma recovery, horticultural therapy, and social justice. And with that, I would love to welcome Tony DeMarco into the room. Welcome, Tony. We're so glad to have you here with us today.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for the introduction, and good morning to everyone on the call. So glad that there are so many people here joining us today for this presentation. And we're, as a team, as we've been working on this, we're just very excited to be able to share with all of you our experience of learning about NMT and implementing NMT in our county systems, and being able to share that experience with all of you as we try to support other locations to do the same. So I just welcome you all here today. Thank you for being here. So what we will be covering for you today is just a very brief overview of what NMT is, especially for those of you that may not be at all familiar with it. I know that there's probably a range of folks on this webinar that have maybe heard a little bit about it, may have read some of Dr. Perry's work, may have had training in it in some way. But we want to have a general platform from which we can move from in terms of general concepts of NMT, and then what that looks like with each of the three counties that we'll be sharing with you, as they're each in very different phases or kinds of implementation process within their county system. So you can see both what the model is about and then how it looks differently in different locations, which is actually one of the benefits of choosing NMT, because it is a model, an approach that really can be modified, not modified, but applied in different ways for what your local needs might be. So next slide. Just wanted to start off with a quote from Dr. Perry himself. He really focuses so much, even though his model is a neurodevelopmental model of brain development and really kind of taking that science into what we need to understand from that in order to be helpers and to be supportive of children and families' recovery process. His real focus is healthy relationships and the importance of the role of healthy relationships in human development and how critical that is. And I think especially in today's world, we can't emphasize that enough. And so this quote, "The more healthy relationship a child has, the more likely he or she will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love." And I think we see that played out and manifested in the work that we do in doing NMT every day. Next slide, please. So in terms of bringing it to the connection, direct connection with complex care, the purposes of this webinar, as Jessica was saying, we know that youth with complex care needs have longstanding gaps in multiple systems. These are the kids that we work with all the time. I know in my years in San Mateo County, the two teams I started off with in San Mateo County were the juvenile probation mental health team and the child welfare mental health teams. And at those times, we were co-located with those two departments and worked very, very closely and very hands-on doing intensive work. And so I saw this from the very beginning, all through my career, in terms of the kids in our systems having what we now refer to as complex care needs that oftentimes our systems just weren't set up to support in the best ways that we could have been, and even with all of our efforts. And so here we are still talking about how do we help find ways to bring our services and our different departments together to work better together with a shared goal of helping kids with these complex care needs. We know that systems in different ways, and you'll hear a little bit about that today, have secured funding, both braided funding, local initiative fundings, foundation fundings, things like that, to help close the gaps in terms of creating different services along with the NMT model, and with that kind of guiding the way that we would be looking at that. And what we try to do is to align those services, those efforts, that implementation process, with the understanding of brain development and how the brain heals. And by doing that, really helping kids in our systems become more stable, more functional, to be able to recover and heal and grow and move forward and develop in the ways that we would like to see them be able to do, and to meet those needs that have not been met previously. Next slide. So this slide is a slide that Dr. Perry uses often. It's one that I've always used when talking with certainly shareholders, department leaders, board of supervisor members, people that I want to kind of understand what we're talking about in terms of the importance of understanding brain development. Because so often we end up chasing problems, right, with funding. When we look at brain science and brain development, we know that the greatest capacity for a child's development and to change the course of that development is in the first 5 to 6 years of a child's life, that because the brain's still developing at a very rapid rate. And yet and after that, it kind of stabilizes out. It doesn't mean that change isn't possible. It is. It just takes longer, takes more repetition, as we will kind of share with you. And yet our systems are set up in kind of opposition to that, where we give the majority of our funding as kids get older and they get more complex and further into our systems. And the return on that, oftentimes, we have our funders asking, so why are we spending all this money in this way? What is the benefit of it? How can we see change? And so that's a big question for today, right? Why NMT? And so we hope that we will be able to at least answer that to some degree for you, that in implementing NMT, what we have seen is that we get a greater outcome, a better benefit to our efforts in using NMT as our organizing model, in terms of what we do, where we put our efforts, how we fund money into certain interventions. And so that's why I'm starting with this slide, is that we hope that you can see how this makes sense. Next slide, please. So as Jessica started to share with you in the intro, what is NMT? It is the neurosequential model of therapeutics is a trauma-informed and developmentally sensitive approach to clinical problem solving. It's a biologically based model. It's based in biological brain science and neuroscience. And what is really wonderful about this model is that it doesn't replace anything that we're already doing. It doesn't say that you can only use NMT and this is the only way to approach your work. If anything, it is a model that helps direct what we're already doing in a way that it becomes more effective. And it helps us understand why what we're doing works, and also why something isn't working, something that we are hoping would be effective and isn't. It gives us a way to maybe step back and look at everything around that child and maybe come to a different understanding of how to do what we're doing, when to do what we're doing, and to look at what are some of the things that might be getting in the way of it being a more effective approach or intervention. Next slide. So these are the different aspects of the neurosequential network. It started many years ago with the neurosequential model of therapeutics. It has been growing exponentially, really, over the years, and now has been developed into similar models or aspects of the model that are applied and utilized and trained in schools so there's the NME, the neurosequential model of education, the neurosequential model of early childhood mental health, especially Christy Brandt's work in Napa with the Infant Mental Health Institute, the neurosequential model of caregiving that's really specific for caregivers, foster parents, people who are in that role. The neurosequential model of reflective supervision, which is really a reflective practice model that helps to build kind of the supervisory framework, if you will, for a system that is utilizing NM approaches. And then the NM of sports. So there's a neurosequential model of sports that is now being developed and rolled out in many different areas. And so we really see the application of this growing because it is so biologically based and universal from that perspective. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the biologically based approach, we're really talking about biological relativity. What does that mean? It means that, and this applies to all of us, not just our kids in our system. And that's really what I love about NMT as well, is that there are so many parallels to this model of it applies to training our staff and the work that they do clinically or case management approach in different probation or social work education, that it applies to those areas in terms of what we do, but it also teaches us when we learn it that it applies to us, it applies to our kids, it applies to our friends and our family. It's universal in the respect of what we learn and what we come to understand about how people respond to life. So we know that the impact of any event or experience is greatest on the most active and changing part of the brain. So this is like for little kids, we know that the lower parts of their brains are under heavy development as they're growing. And so the impact or experience of something that happens, for example, to a 3-year-old may have greater impact to that developing brain and its systems than the same experience might have for a 16-year-old. So this is part of how we use the biological aspect of it to understand the importance of that child's story and their history and when things happened and how it happened to them and what that impact might lead to. We know that the power of any experience is greatest during this development, and that experiences during the organization of these neural systems have a big impact on all the systems that get developed after that. So we talk about this being the neurological scaffolding that is happening in the brain all the time as kids develop. And so things that come in and affect that at the lower parts of the brain have impact and help direct, if you will, the development of higher levels of the brain later on in life. Next slide, please. The other thing for me as a trauma clinician, because I came into NMT after doing 20 years of work with survivors and trauma survivors and kids with complex care. And at that time in our field, we were still really talking about neglect and trauma as being almost interchangeable, as if they were the same thing. And from a biological perspective, the thing that Dr. Perry has taught me and taught many, many other people is that in the development of the brain and the impact of the brain, trauma and neglect are very different. And so that in our field, for the kids that we work with that have both of these things most of the time, to some degree, that's a really important distinction when we want to understand what the impact of that has on their development and how they're showing up today in our systems and what their needs might be. So we know that neglect is the absence of the things that a developing brain might need to come online, if you will, and develop in the way fully in the way that we would like it to. And so without that proper input, those systems, those capacities might be impacted in some ways, may be underdeveloped. Trauma, on the other hand, is an impact that creates disorganization in those neural networks. And because of the impact of that, we may see what we would clinically refer to as maladaptive behaviors or triggered responses or other things that are really based in this disorganization of a neural network and an arousal system in that child's brain. And so, like I said before, we know that some kids have both of these. They have underdeveloped systems in some ways and disorganized systems in others. And that's why when they show up in our systems, they're so complex and confusing and challenging at times to know how to support and help when they're with us. Next slide, please. So the basic brain heuristic, or the basic heuristic of the model, is really, we have lots of variations of this kind of slide. But for today's limited time, we just want to share with you a couple of things about this. So we talk about the upside down pyramid. This is the brain model that Dr. Perry utilizes most often in his work to describe very complex things, right? But for the purposes of what we need to understand when using NMT, it's really this, that we've got these four major areas of the brain that in NMT, we're not only understanding and looking at for assessment purposes and to understand a child's history and development, but also these are the four areas of the brain that we target sequential interventions. And the sequential part of the neurosequential model is a very intentional piece, that because the brain is developed sequentially from the bottom up and the inside out, it makes sense for us to also target our interventions in a sequential way. So that oftentimes what we look at when we assess a child in NMT is we want to look at what is the lowest part of the brain that's the most impacted, so we can start there. So oftentimes doing cognitive-based interventions comes later down the road. So often in NMT, what's different about this model is we're doing much more somatosensory, activity-based, rhythmic, repetitive-based activities and interventions to help stabilize these lower systems in the brain that really are controlling a lot of the time things like sensory integration, regulation, and relational capacities. And so this is part of why you'll hear people in NMT talk a lot about sensory diets and alternative kinds of interventions than just talk therapy, a 50-minute talk therapy hour. Next slide. So again, as I was saying before, this is kind of a model that shows that sequential development, that the brain stem to the cortex, we develop from in utero through the rest of our life, from development from the bottom up, from the inside out. And we know that the higher up in the brain, the more plasticity there is, the more capacity for change. So that's why doing cortical or cognitive-based work is important, because it's really utilizing that very plastic part of the brain that is the most changeable. But with the understanding that the lower parts of the brain are less able to change in the same ways, and so they require more repetition, more sensory-based input than cognitive-based interventions. And so we know that the organization and functional capacity of these neural systems are sequential, and that they do not have equal valence through development. So things that happen earlier on in life oftentimes have a greater impact than things that happen later on in life, as I was saying before. Next slide. So this is one of those slides that we use a lot with our partner agencies and in our case conferencing. And so this is where this really hits the road in terms of how does this change our practice? How does this help our work with complex care kids? How does this help our work with our partner agencies and other areas? It's really about understanding that because of this sequential development of the brain and the way that we respond to input from the outside world in our internal sense, that in order to really be effective, we need to practice what we call the 3 R's: regulate, relate, reason. Meaning that when a child is really lit up or having a reaction or having a stressful time, they're less likely to be able to benefit from us coming in and trying to talk to them. Because that part of their brain is really not online. They are much more in their lower parts of their brain, more reactive, more dysregulated. And so our key goal then is to find ways to help them regulate so that they feel safe and calm. And then we are more likely to be able to use our relational interventions to create some trust and connection. And then from that, there's hopefully the capacity to do some reflective reasoning and talking through what may have just happened or what needs to happen next. And so this is also a model that I've used with, in CTI training with law enforcement and first responders, that when you are the first person on the scene with somebody who's really having a major crisis, this is what you need to pay attention to. This is how you can make a difference if you can help that person calm down enough that then you have the opportunity to be able to connect with them and to talk through what's going on. Next slide. So on this also comes this concept of the way that the brain responds to the world is that we are responding from our brainstem up. So this is the triggered responses that we oftentimes see with people that we're working with, where they're, they're 1 to 100, 0 to 60, if you will, in a split second. This is what's happening in the brain, is that the brain is reacting to stimulus way before the cognitive, the lower part of the brain is reacting to a perceived threat, if you will, before the thinking part of the brain can actually determine whether or not it is. And so we know that along with this kind of regulate, relate, reason model, the understanding that kids and parents, all of us, we're going to act before we're able to feel what's going on and then think about what that means for us. And so this concept of understanding kind of what's going on internally for someone in order for us to have a more appropriate response is really important. And it really helps to teach our systems how to take that into consideration when we're working with kids in congregate care, in foster homes, in a classroom, in the community, or in any of our treatment services. Next slide, please. Why is this important? Because what it teaches us is what the patterns of stress can do. And, in trauma work, we've gone from looking at trauma to, the basic question of what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and understanding the story of how somebody, got to where they are, and it matters when we want to understand how they're showing up. But it's also moved now into looking at resiliency. How do we build resilience? How do we get past adverse experiences and the understanding of that to what helps kids and families become or stay resilient? And so in order to do that, we need to understand how patterns of stress can either create a more sensitized or dysregulated system, or a more resilient and growing system. And so this is one of Dr. Perry's models around understanding that anytime any of us are in situations where things are unpredictable, extreme, and prolonged, over time especially, we may become more dysregulated and more sensitized to those things than we were even before. If a child's growing up in that kind of an environment, their ability to develop resilience may be very limited. So what we want to produce, what we want to create and put into systems with our kids are things that are predictable and moderate and controllable from their perspective, right? Anytime we can give, and having worked with many sexual abuse survivors, this is one of the first things that innately I just always did was, you have control. You get to say what the rules are. We work on your pace to the degree that you're comfortable. And as much as we can do that with people, it gives them back a level of control and authority over themselves that maybe they've never had before. And in doing that, we are actually helping to create an experience where they can become more resilient and can recover. Next slide. So this is a slide that we developed in San Mateo County that just takes a lot of these concepts and kind of layers them on top of each other in terms of how we understand this kind of regulate, relate, reason model, where it lives in the brain, and how it connects to these 4 domains of intervention, and why that matters. So that when we're talking about the regulate part of the brain, we're really talking about sensory input and the survival part of the brain. And so looking at what are the interventions that maybe we need to be incorporating for that part of the brain to help stabilize sensory integration issues and sensory overwhelm and things like that, that oftentimes get missed. Especially for our little ones. We found that in San Mateo quite a bit, that a lot of our kids had sensory issues that nobody had recognized before. And that made all the difference in the world, because if you can't manage your sensory input, it's really difficult then to self-regulate. And if you can't self-regulate, it's really hard to maintain healthy relationships with other people if you're emotionally all over the place all the time. And so these are how these things connect. So we want to stabilize the sensory part of the brain. We want to help kids learn tools and ways to self-regulate, because we know the more they can do that, the better chance they have of creating healthy relationships with people and with others. And then the cognitive part of the brain can come online and learn more skills and benefit and help to build more neural pathways that then can offset maybe the reactivity of a disorganized pathway from trauma. So those are some of the ways that we look at the way that we understand the sequencing of the brain development and how we use our interventions along with that. Next slide, please. Again, so the 4 domains of intervention are based on these things: sensory integration, self-regulation, relational health, and cognitive capacity. And so in NMT, this is something we come back to all the time, because it's the way that we create what would, in clinical terms, we would call a treatment plan. And in NMT, the other piece of it, and you'll hear me refer to this a little bit later on, in doing our recommendations, which is the treatment plan, it's not just for the child. This is another big difference in NMT. It's really about using these 4 domains, the understanding of that, and then looking at how to create a therapeutic web of what does this child need in these 4 areas to really develop and to heal and to grow. And in order for us to maintain that, what does that child need in their home? So that means, what do their parents need? What do their siblings need? What does the home environment need that's going to support this? And then what does that family need within their community to support them supporting their child? So it's really a much wider net therapeutic web of support that we look at to put things in place as much as we can that will support ultimately the growth and healing of that individual child. And so this has a lot of implications for residential care, for reentry services, for reunification services of kids moving not just back to biological families, but if they're making moves within foster homes, considerations for what environment are we moving them to, and does that environment have enough of a therapeutic web to really maintain and continue this child's growth? Because we see those problems come up in transitions all the time, where a child's doing really well in one environment, and then we think, oh, they're doing so great, let's move them over here to this family, and then things start to fall apart. because oftentimes we haven't looked at how do we maintain the things that are working for that child in this environment and really let that move with this child to this new environment so that they don't lose momentum. And as we're looking at changes coming from the state in the tier rates for in foster care and utilizing the CANS assessments, these are really things that we see kind of coming together and that NMT can help us look at from that perspective so that we're not missing those pieces when kids are moving through our system in different ways and to different levels. Next slide, please. So I'm going to end our overview of NMT with this slide. Again, just to bring it back that, in doing trauma-informed services, we always, in our systems, we want to be trauma-informed, and that has gotten better, but it's more than that. To really implement models that change how we do things in an effective way for kids and families, we also need to be developmentally sensitive, and we're going to come back to that again throughout the rest of this morning's presentation, but also biologically respectful. And that's being respectful of how the brain functions and is constructed and how it operates for all of us. And to bring that biological respect into our service provision, our policies, our program implementation, into our interventions, and into our interactions one-on-one with families and kids in our systems, and also with each other. So I will pause there. We are going to then now show a little bit from 3 different counties that have been working very hard on implementing NMT in their county systems, and each one is a little bit different. So the first county that we're going to hear from is Fresno County. That is very early on, and they're in just starting into their 2nd year of their implementation process. And so Jessica Carrillo is with us from Fresno County. Hey, Jess. Good morning. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Tony.
I'll let you introduce yourself, and then you can take it away.
All right. So we can advance to the beginning slides for Fresno County.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I missed. I'm sorry. I missed.
You still have 2 more?
I do.
Okay.
I apologize, everyone.
I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, you can hang on right there. You might want to have something to say about these. I've asked all of our presenters to kind of jump in on a couple of these slides. So I apologize for the disorganization right here. So we were asked to really focus on a couple of key points. How does NMT promote equity in our practice? And I think this is an important point. I know Cindy, who's going to be talking about San Mateo County later on, had these questions come up a lot in our early trainings when we were implementing our first couple of years, especially of NMT training in our system, in terms of racial equity and cultural compassion and respect. And because NMT is, as we've been talking about, biologically based, the understanding of how the brain develops and what that means, and how a developing brain responds to and is impacted by neglect and trauma and stress are fairly universal. And so the racial differences may get looked at in terms of what that child's individual experience was, what the cultural differences were that impacted that child's development within their family or community situation. And so the equity is in the fact that we understand the universal biology of brain development and then apply the racial, cultural differences on an individual basis. And so the thing about NMT is it's individualized. Even though we have these universal understandings about development, everything that we do in NMT is really about what does that mean for this individual child. what are the things that are specific for them? What are the things that impacted them in a way that helps us understand what they need? And so it's not a cookie cutter approach at all. And so there aren't these kind of general rules around culture and race that are applied in any way. So it's really an individualized approach. And again, as I was saying before, the difference between the equity around developmental versus chronological, and this is another big important piece in NMT, is that we look at kids much more from a developmental capacity than their chronological age. And so this is a big issue because so many of the kids, and I saw this for so many years, kids in our systems, especially in the, when they would come into court, had, probation officers or teachers or, parents, foster parents expecting certain things of them because, well, they're 13, they should be able to do this now. And yet developmentally, given what they'd lived through, they were really functioning more like a 8 or 10-year-old. And so our approach to them needs to match to their developmental need and capacity, which may vary in different environments, right? It may not be the same across the board. We may have a kid that's really like full on academic 16-year-old, really bright kid, cognitively and emotionally and in their relational health and their ability to self-regulate in relational settings function much more like a toddler. And so understanding that allows us to create responses and interventions and structures and environments that will help that child with those differences without penalizing them for being struggling in some areas that doesn't match up to the chronological expectations of the adult world. So this is a really important piece, I think, in how we understand equity from that perspective.
And Tony, can I just jump in really quick? Because I think for me, one of the things that really supported my work, not just with the child, the youth, but their family, I think is the epigenetics piece of historically marginalized, oppressed peoples, right? And so it helps you understand this line of generational trauma that has occurred for many groups. Through the epigenetics piece that Dr. Perry also talks about, which is also included in the NMT assessment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a very important piece. We do spend a lot of time looking at epigenetics and just the impact that historic trauma and cultural trauma has on communities and families. And
so Tony, also before we leave, I want to highlight, so I know that this seems very clinical to folks who may not be clinical, but again, when I get into my presentation, I'll share some highlights as to why our Fresno County Child Welfare is truly wanting to implement the model and do see value that the model can be used for intervention planning in a child and family team setting that does have clinical partners. But something that I wanted to point out as far as equity, that also Cindy pointed out, the model and the metrics tool itself really equalizes individual social worker bias because it does focus on the individual experience. It does focus on the individual facts of what occurred in this family setting, and then leans into, okay, how does this affect the child's now experience in all of the social systems that the child sets in, right? So the family is one of the social systems, but as Tony talked about, education system, unfortunately, now part of the child welfare system when they come into our agency or juvenile probation system. And so it really lends itself to really lean into that individual methodology and the story itself. So I just wanted to comment on that before we left this slide.
thank you. The last point I just wanted to say a little bit, limitations. And what I mean by this is really that with NMT, at least from my experience of it, and if other people have had other experiences, please share, that the limitations of the application of NMT in an equitable way really had more to do with the systems as opposed to the model. That where there were limitations of what could be done on behalf of a family or child, sometimes had to do with what was available in a particular community that could be utilized, what kind of funding was available to help with the cost of something that would be helpful for that child or family. And the limitations often, can be in our implementation process, how far along we might be in collaborating around the understanding and education of NMT concepts with our partner groups. And so what I found in San Mateo over a 12-year period of time of implementing it there was that the more our partner departments trained with us, understood it, kind of welcomed. They didn't necessarily get trained in NMT, but the more they welcomed our sharing it with us and bringing it into CFT meetings and case consultations and shared casework, and talking about it at our leadership meetings as a way of doing trauma-informed system change at a larger level, the better it worked and the less limitations we had in our system to actually provide the services that we were trying to provide. Next slide. So NMT in real use settings. So it's not just, as Jessica was saying, it's not just, there is a clinical application, obviously, of people who are trained, do the phase 1 first-year training and learn how to do the full NMT assessment and recommendation or treatment plan. But again, learning the concepts of NMT are valuable in every area of our practice. So I did more than I can remember or count trainings for our shelter care intake workers for CPS, nurses at PES and docs at PES. We worked very closely with our social services partners around CFT meetings and making sure that we were able to bring this in as part of that process. Did hundreds of trainings for our probation partners, worked with special education, actually got them kind of looking at the NME model for our special education programs. Worked very closely with our public health nurses, especially in our pre-to-3 infant mental health programs, because we knew that for them to understand what we were doing was really important. So that, again, we want to work in parallel, right? We brought in community partners that made up not just our nonprofit groups that also became part of our NMT training partners, but because they were also sometimes the service providers that we then turned to provide yoga and equine therapy and rhythm and drumming circles and all kinds of other interventions in NMT that we would then refer families for. And so this is how we create the therapeutic web in NMT. It's not just the child and family and their community, but it's also all of our partner groups and bringing everybody along as much as we can, so that we can use the concepts to shape how we approach things, and also the full clinical assessment tool with the interventions that get laid out as part of that child's treatment process. Are there any comments from any of the other presenters about any of these points before we move on?
So I wanted to share, again, we are only in our second year of implementation, but we have completed one MSW practitioner cohort that has been phase 1 trained, and so they are certified in use of the MMT metric tool. And we have started to partner with the assigned child and family team members, including the assigned social workers, therapists, wraparound providers, and are able to have a very good conversation and intervention planning that is very specific to where the child is at brain functioning. And so that has really helped to stabilize our some of our high needs kids. So while we are still in the training phases and early implementation, we decided that we needed to, while we are acclimating and understanding the metrics, we needed to use the information in real time with real cases with youth that were having difficulty, and we have seen success. And so being able to have all of the treatment team understand brain development in the way that you need to sequentially layer interventions by starting again at that primary brain functional level, it really has helped. So I just wanted to share that before leaving this. Having a shared knowledge of the bio, the social entity really helps. Now we are starting with where the child is actually functionally at, irregardless of age, and we have seen success.
Thank you. And I just saw in the comments a couple of things about asking about NME. Yes, the neurosequential model of education, it's something that is used in educational settings. There's a full training program specifically in that model, and we can get more information out to folks about that if there's interest. So thank you, Cindy, for responding to that. And then another plug for mental health, occupational therapy. Absolutely. What we found is that our OTs actually became very critical members of any of our treatment teams because they held so much expertise around sensory integration and sensory profiles and sensory assessments that were really useful in promoting and moving forward any of our NMT work. So thank you for that comment. Next slide. And here we are to Fresno, and I will turn it back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Tony. Let me once again formally introduce myself. My name is Jessica Carrillo. I'm a division chief here in Fresno County Department of Social Services. I am currently the lead assigned division chief over our neurosequential model of therapeutics implementation. And also, I am the assigned division chief for our complex care implementation and layered services development, and the administrator over our youth shelter. And so really looking at what currently have we done to support youth with high needs, what innovations are out there that can help. And so that now is my full-time job. So really happy to be here with you this morning. We can go to the next slide. So as Tony shared, Fresno County Department of Social Services, we are in our early phase of implementation of the neurosequential model of therapeutics. This is a quick timeline of where we are at. So we are just in our second year. As I mentioned before, we have completed a group of phase 1 trainees. I mentioned that we have a group of MSW practitioner and child welfare trained, but we also embarked on this journey collectively with our partners as Tony stated, this really is about developing that therapeutic net and looking at all of the agencies and departments that work with our youth collectively. And so our phase 1 trainings are offered in partnership with our Department of Behavioral Health and our contracted vendors, our mental health vendors, as well as in this first grouping, we did have trainees from our public health nurses. And so really trying to collectively take a look at who should be in the training. And so phase 1 training is going to be continued a collaborative and connection of that. Our first year of general training, and I'll go more into it in the next slide. As we were developing our ideas of implementation, we understood that, as Tony said, we needed to let the network of supports and agencies be aware of what the neurosequential model tenets were. And so while we started phase 1 training, we also started more general trainings to bring a community awareness of what the neurosequential model brings and offers for intervention planning. But our first year, we decided the best way, and we've seen this in other initiatives that Fresno County has been involved in, we really needed to train our line staff supervisors, because we understood that our line staff supervisors are the ones that support system cultural change in our agency. And so our first general training year, we did the leadership sessions. And so this is our broad plan for now. Again, we are still training phase 1 trainers, and we'll, in this year though, we are starting in our second year in 2025, because we have completed our leadership sessions as our foundational general session. We have started in August, actually training MMT model concepts to our social worker staff and our community at large. And so we're really excited about that as our goal for our second year of implementation. But we can go to the next slide. So part of implementation, we took a step back. We definitely were, again, are in phase 1. We are committed to developing a Fresno Child MM unit. But we also knew we needed to spread the word. But doing a quick system assessment, we definitely understood the importance of our social work supervisors and understanding the concepts. And so our first full year of general sessions, we devoted to having Dr. Perry educate our leadership teams. This included supervisors, this included all of our division chiefs and social services, because again, collectively, we know on our benefits side that our leadership team needed to understand the work of the neurosequential model and the adjustment in our thinking around the effects of trauma and how to support those folks who have had severe trauma. And again, thinking about the collective, that not only did the youth and children that child welfare is serving had the effects of trauma, but there was also a lot of generational trauma. And so we needed to revisit, even on our eligibility side, the brain functioning level of the population we were serving. And so we developed with Dr. Perry these leadership sessions that targeted the direct support that supervisors, managers, deputies, even our director attended, so that we had a basic understanding of the sequential steps that are needed, of the importance of developing the relationships, and also understanding that our staff come to us in different functional levels, depending on what they are experiencing in that moment. So we also were able to connect, how do we support by using the concepts of the neurosequential model, the secondary trauma responses that our staff had. And so that was our first general session. And again, it was offered to supervision and above. And it really did help. We were able to, as leadership teams, have very good discussions, and now are developing other supports for staff, so that we can get them to the critical thinking layer of their brain functioning that is needed when we are making these very important life decisions in partnership with the child and family teaming that we're doing. We can go to the next slide. Again, the thought was we were not going to do this in silo, and we also wanted to formalize our implementation. As I said, it is a team and community effort. Our phase 1 training groups are combined groups. We can go to the next slide. So how did we do this? So again, we really wanted to formalize it. And so we have written in the neurosequential model of therapeutics as a requirement as part of our training for our vendors, particularly our clinical vendors. And but we did this first by just connecting. We hosted a kickoff, and it was open up to all of our community service providers, our education partners, probation, basically our entire community of core agencies that work with our high-risk populations, both families and children specifically. And so we had conversations about what would be the benefit of these concepts. And Dr. Perry did come and host those kickoffs for us, and was able to give us a shared understanding of the shifts in our philosophy here in Fresno. Then after that, we had very, very frequent development meetings with our partners. So with our behavioral health, with our public health nurses, with our mental health specialty vendors that work with foster youth here in our community, to really design what this training contract should look like and who should be part of the phase 1 training groups, and then who should then be included in the general sessions. And so we definitely, and we continue to meet with our partners on a regular basis. And then we are now in our sharing phase. We are sharing internally and with our partners where we are at in implementation. We shared some learning email blasts celebrating that we completed our first phase 1 cohort, and then letting people know that we are now using the summary tool of the neurosequential model of therapeutics in child and family team meetings. Now that we have phase 1 internal child welfare practitioners trained, those practitioners are now partnering with our second group that is going through phase 1 and doing metrics with real cases and going into those CFTs and explaining the recommendations and what the layered services should look like for a handful. Again, we're starting small, but a handful of high needs youth that we are now venturing out to implement some interventions as recommended by the metrics tool. We also, as I said, formalize the neurosequential model training, either phase 1 training or the general sessions for our contracts. Specifically, we are part of the Continuum of Care Crisis, Children's Crisis Pilot. Here we like to call it the Child Wellbeing Project. We are one of 8 that were selected to implement that project. And we intentionally wrote in that our 2 selected vendors that will be doing the tenets of the Children's Crisis Pilot with us will have phase 1 certified clinical staff working in our enhanced intensive service teams, in our emergency enhanced intensive service teams, along with our high intense, what we call super wrap teams. And so we are again layering on the neurosequential model metrics tool to really identify the starting points of where intervention should begin based on that brain functionality that the recommendations give us. And so we're really excited about that. We see the neurosequential model as the system way to do layered services for high needs kids. You can go to the next slide, please. So as I talked about, we are now in our second year and we have kicked off general sessions for social work staff and other direct care staff in our communities and in our partner agencies. We just started that, our first general session. And we also do have our site coordinator now. So we were able to get a site coordinator the end of 2024. His name is Jose Vargas. And so he is leading didactic facilitation of general training sessions that Dr. Bruce Perry has developed to specifically target and enhance the knowledge of the concepts of neurosequential model. So while systems and our agencies may not be able to send everyone through phase 1 training, we understood the importance of understanding the concepts. Because for us, when we are developing the neurosequential model unit, that would be the child welfare MSW practitioner unit, we again very clearly understood from our conversations with our partners and with the neurosequential model network team members, it's not going to be that social worker that is going to be implementing the intervention. And so we need understanding of the how and why. And that is why the general sessions and development of them was so important. And we wrote that in our training contract, that not only would we want phase 1 trained clinical partners and MSW practitioners and nurses, we needed to have a very strong foundational knowledge of the concepts of neurosequential model. So then with the recommended interventions, we could have the buy-in already from the other child and family team members. We are now just kicking that off. And so this time next year, I hope to share how successful we are and how successful the interventions are being that are recommended from the metrics tools that we continue to do. But we're really excited. Just anecdotally, our site coordinator, Jose Vargas, has shared that staff, in particular, social work staff, are really excited and it feels natural to them. Now they kind of understand why the parents and the youth are behaving in manners that don't match maybe the chronological age. And their frustration level has come down with working with what we used to call, these high needs kids, or that, right? The word non-compliant parent. We are no longer using those phrases. We are now saying, okay, what happened? Let us discuss that. It also lends itself to our ability to use the engagement tools from safety organized practice. Let's say again, it's about appreciative inquiry, not guilt or shame. But the neurosequential model, again, as a layered assessment tool, also helps us to target where to start in the healing of that trauma exposure. What level of brain functioning should we be at? Should we be at the very basic, where we need to consistently have a routine and set up that 9 a.m. phone call every Tuesday with this mom so she develops trust? And these are the real life things that we're doing now. And it's made such a huge difference. So I'll check in next year and let you know how the general sessions have really changed case planning for us. But we're really excited about the early responses that we're getting from the training. Next slide. As I talked about, we were on a two-path journey. So we definitely understood that we needed the general tenets of the model to change our system culture and how we engage with folks and the connection to safety organized practice. But we also understood that there's a connection to CANS. And so with that, we are committed to developing a neurosequential model of therapeutics child welfare unit. So there will be a specialty unit that, again, part of our layered services implementation and design will complete the tool and then link in with the child and family team and assigned social worker to organize interventions and help designate what level of intervention to start with. And those are from the metrics recommendations. But also then, as we in child welfare are required to do the IP CANs, really then connecting, okay, this is the level of brain functioning intervention that the tool, the MMT tool says. Now taking CANs and then deciding what area of social functioning. So we have the brain functioning, individual need, and then we have the system, social system needs of the child. And so then we can really designate where to start intervention. So if we see that from the IP CANs, there really is a need for peer-to-peer social interactions. And then from the neurosequential model tool, we see that the functioning is very deficient in that trust, mistrust, that brainstem functioning, then we can really start designing what that intervention looks like. So we're not just throwing services off. We're really designing what intervention and understanding that intervention may need to start with that primary caregiver. And again, with developing that routine to develop trust. And so, and that is a very needed intervention for many of our youth. They just need to know someone is going to be there. And so we can develop that intervention very intentionally. And so that's where we're going. We are starting our development of our unit in conversations directly with the Neurosequential Model Network team members and Dr. Perry himself. And we will be starting that next month. So I also hope that in a year or so, I can share what our neurosequential model MSW practitioner unit has been working on. And again, we are thinking about tracking tools for the metrics as they're completed.
What's wrong, George?
And so just really excited to use the tool as a layered assessment for our systems work with CANS. Next slide. So real life application, as I said, we are currently, our phase one first group of trainees are currently completing metrics tools on active cases. One of the things that we have found to support our caregivers, because what we've, again, something that we have learned from the neurosequential model is a dysregulated caregiver cannot help a dysregulated child. And so there is a caregiver tool. And so we have completed caregiver tools on some of our caregivers, both non-related and related. And it's able to provide us a roadmap based on what the caregiver supports need to be. And so it really has provided tangible things. And one of the tools showed again that the caregiver was lacking a support network for themselves. And so we were able to design in the child and family team setting, what did that need to look like? Who were the natural supports? She was able to really focus and take a look at that. Well, she didn't believe she had natural supports because she was really looking only at biological family relationships. But when we explained to her that natural supports don't necessarily have to be family members, she was able to identify some, and we were able to build that in to the case plan. That certain people would help her with transportation, certain people will help with what she labeled, I just need someone to check in on me. So we labeled it a check-in call, and that person was scheduled to give her a check-in call. And so that again seems a very simple application, but if we didn't have the non-sequential model concepts to help us design these things and understand that the caregiver, there are certain identified supports based on their level of functioning as well, we wouldn't have got probably much traction in a very short amount of time, by the way. Also, again, we are using the tool to provide, as I said, the interventions in the most affected domain. And so we are again interlaying that with the CANS assessment to really target where to start first. So again, that idea of sequencing. And so it really has helped focus the case planning to the most critical parts, both for the individual aspect and then the social functioning aspect areas that CANS identifies. And the general knowledge of brain developments has helped our social workers engage in a better way. Well, we are a safety organized county and have been one for a long time. Knowing where the individual brain functioning is has really helped us be very intentional about the types of wording, the types of rapport building techniques that we are using. So again, it removes our bias of chronological age from us, and it really helps us develop that better sense of how do we build an engagement plan? And that's a new term for us. How do we build an engagement plan for this particular client based on their functionalities and based on their experiences of trauma and how that has affected them? Because as we know in child welfare, every person that is essentially working with our system has some type of trauma that they need to continue to work through. And so this has really helped in redesigning our thoughts around that. And so that's my part. I know there might be many questions. I see a lot of chat in the chat comments, but I will turn it over to our next presenters. So thank you, everyone. I hope to share more as we progress in our implementation.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I am Rachel Talamontes, and I am with the County of Santa Clara, our Behavioral Health Services Department. And I am a certified trainer and a mentor in the neurosequential model of therapeutics. And currently, I'm a division director overseeing programs and initiatives that overlay heavily with child welfare and juvenile justice. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Michelle, to introduce herself, and then I'll walk us through the next few slides.
Hi, good morning. I'm Michelle Hauk. I'm also with Santa Clara County Behavioral Health. I'm a senior program manager and am so grateful to be one of our NMT champions and trainers in our department and county system, specifically because most of the programs that I'm working directly with are supporting our youth in the child welfare and juvenile justice populations. And as we'll talk about in our slides, just there's so much of an overlay where the NMT work has supported that.
Thank you, Michelle. So we'll start off, I'll be talking about kind of our big picture and visioning for NMT, and then Michelle will talk about the specifics of our implementation. In Santa Clara County, we implemented NMT initially focused in our in custody juvenile justice settings, more specifically at a program at Juvenile Hall. And in our juvenile hall, we have a behavioral health team from our department that's embedded into the work at juvenile hall and work hand in hand with probation in terms of the care and treatment for youth in that setting. And so today our goal is to really share why NMT was selected as a practice, as well as our implementation plan. On this slide, you'll see kind of our vision of the Juvenile Justice Treatment Program. In 2020, we were presented with the opportunity to build a treatment program that would offer a deeper level of therapy and integrated care and other behavioral health focused supports for youth and their families. Prior to 2020, our goal in terms of the work at Juvenile Hall was really more of a kind of stabilization and maintenance model while decisions were being made in terms of where youth would go after their stay at juvenile hall. But in 2020, we were working with probation around a program where youth would be staying for longer periods of time at juvenile hall. And so we really wanted to develop a treatment model that would be able to serve their needs for the long term rather than the short term. As part of the program development, we looked at data from our probation partners, data that our own department had, and really aimed to identify the complexity of needs that youth had that were at juvenile hall. We also really wanted to gather perspectives from various stakeholders. And so we had several town hall type forums and focus groups with youth, with caregivers, probation staff, and other system partners. And one of the things that really came out of that is that when youth are in longer term kind of unnatural, if you will, controlled settings, that transition out to life in the community upon release, there's been a lot of changes with family, their community, etc. And so one of the things that was really important to us in thinking about the development of a treatment program was really how we can help youth stay connected to their family and their community, and really hone in on that as an opportunity to support the building of relationships even while youth were in custody to better support that transition. And so, as I mentioned, a big shift for us was really moving from a stabilization and crisis model to a longer term focused treatment model, and really supporting the acuity of needs that we were seeing in the population and still continue to see, while preparing for readiness and release and successful community reintegration. And in addition to that, we wanted to also have an approach that wasn't a cookie cutter approach, that was very individualized and really being mindful of each youth's individual cultural and developmental needs, particularly as they're growing over time. And so our vision was really created with multiple stakeholders. And so you'll, as you see here in the slides, had a focus on therapeutic supports, integrated care, really honing in on both kind of mental health and substance use needs, and supporting kind of the predominance of what we were seeing in the population related to really significant trauma, anxiety, depression, and other emotional needs. We also really wanted an approach that was developmentally focused, and Dr. Perry will often use the term a biologically respectful approach. So we really wanted to understand behavior through a trauma-informed and developmentally appropriate lens, and think about how we can support the learning of coping strategies for stress, impulsivity, and self-regulation through a neurobiologically sensitive lens. As well as really supporting youth as well as their family natural support systems for when they would leave juvenile hall and return to family and the community, and really kind of consider that longer term, bigger picture need. Next slide, please. And since this implementation was embedded in our juvenile justice setting, we worked with a variety of partners that work hand in hand with supporting youth and families in the system. And so we had partnerships and input from multiple entities to design and implement our program, which included juvenile probation, who are with the youth 24/7, day to day, our own behavioral health team, the Santa Clara County Office of Education, who's providing all of the educational needs for youth on site, the custody health team, which is through our Valley Medical Center, looking at physical health and other needs, as well as our court system. And as I mentioned before, are really honing in on making sure we had community input and voice. And so our partnership was really meant to be kind of collective. We didn't want to make the decision around going with NMT kind of in a silo individually. So this was really something that was vetted and talked about with all of the partners that you see here, and really honing in on what Tony was talking about earlier about this idea of how do we build a therapeutic web to best meet the complex unmet needs of many of our youth. Next slide, please. So part of why we gravitated towards NMT, I think I've alluded to it a bit already, was really wanting to look at how we could think about behavior through a trauma and a developmental lens, a brain developmental lens, if you will, rather than kind of this solely like we just need to fix the kid, right? That's often like, what's the magic solution? How do we fix the kid? And we really wanted not only our behavioral health team, but in working with our partners, to be able to utilize an approach that would help us think about the complexity of trauma and development intersecting with kind of the more externalized or internalized behaviors that are often of concern. In addition to this, as we were developing the program in 2020, 2021, there were some significant events that were occurring both locally and nationally that really influenced our implementation around really needing an approach that was really thinking about trauma and the idea of what's happening to our youth. We had a mass shooting in our county at the Gilroy Garlic Festival a year or two prior. It was pretty significant in terms of how it impacted the south component of our county in Gilroy, but really had other effects throughout the county. Of course, we had the COVID stay-at-home orders and how children and youth were experiencing that sense of isolation, the increase around struggles economically. We saw increased hardships and inequities across kind of access to healthcare. George Floyd's murder amplified those local conversations about equity, justice, and systemic racism. And then in May 2021, there was another mass shooting in Santa Clara County that affected our public transit for several weeks, affecting those with socioeconomic trauma, kind of their needs, if you will, the most, and people who really relied on public transportation, as well as kind of being a reminder of other things that had happened more locally, things that were happening nationally, but then also what's happening in youth and families in terms of their own individual lives. So those were all some of the things that kind of led us to thinking about how we wanted to move forward with an approach. And so, so NMT in some ways became a response to these overlapping crises and the societal impacts that we were seeing in the youth. And so as we were designing and thinking about a treatment program and kind of the healing approaches that we wanted to use and looking at NMT as one of our options, one of the things that we were looking at in terms of things we were seeing with youth was that there had been a lot of disruption to the daily structure and their social supports. We'd been seeing academic disengagement that was kind of a larger variable than we had seen in the past, in part due to COVID and the stay-at-home hour orders and the shifts in the educational system at that time, and then limited access to other kinds of resources, as well as heightened vulnerability to abuse and neglect, stress, fear, trauma, etc. Next slide. So in response, we've thought about NMT and really looked at the clinical design of NMT as both a timely fit as well as a clinical fit. All of the factors that I mentioned kind of moved us forward to utilizing NMT as the key component of our clinical design, supporting our ability to highlight the impact of trauma, kind of move away or be mindful of more cookie cutter types of interventions so that we could really target specifically on individualized youth and family needs. Really looking at a model, as NMT does, to provide a more holistic view of youth and not just focus on behavior, but what's underlying a young person's experience and their connection to family and community, and really promoting the idea of that therapeutic web. Also knowing that in adolescence, while neuroplasticity may not be as vibrant as in the earlier kind of years, there certainly are significant developmental opportunities that we could leverage while youth would be in our program. The individualized framework helped us meet kind of youth where they are. So I think it supported, and it was our intention to support us in being able to better engage youth and family. Also promoting emotional regulatory support, social functioning strengths, a healing-oriented model, and underlying capacities for empathy was really important to kind of our work, but also the input that the system partners gave us. So ultimately, NMT is really helping us and our system move from asking that kind of question of what's wrong with this youth to what happened to this youth and what do they need to heal and thrive. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Michelle, and she's going to talk more about the specifics of how we built out our NMT site.
Thanks, Rachel. You can go to the next slide. I'll try to go through this fairly quickly. You'll have the slides to refer back to, but really to just kind of touch on, our implementation, lessons learned, and things that might be helpful if you're thinking about bringing this to your system. Because I definitely want to make sure we have space for Cindy to talk about San Mateo's implementation. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick timeline. Like Rachel said, we started, it feels like we've been doing this forever. It's really only been since 2021. I think one of the advantages that our team had is that we already had a few key folks that were trained in NMT that really helped to then champion it and be trainers for these future cohorts. So since 2021, we've had one cohort each year, which when I briefly talk about some of our lessons learned is something that we've really thought about, just maybe how to slow down our implementation a little bit. Next slide, please. So just some of the highlights of what our implementation has looked like. Again, a lot of the emphasis has been around this phase 1 certification, which takes about 10 to 12 months and is really intense. We first started with our program in our juvenile justice system in juvenile hall, like Rachel said. And one of our lessons learned was we were starting to train a bunch of clinicians in this model as this program was also simultaneously developing. So we had a lot of new folks joining the team, kind of getting their bearings even just with the population, with the program, while also training in this really interesting but can be intensive, especially in the beginning model. So that was kind of a lesson learned that, again, as we're really thinking about the future of our implementation, just how do we really take in, the different components and the different competing priorities that our systems have. In addition to the phase 1 certification, we find time to bring our system together. So we not only have our clinicians in our juvenile justice clinic trained, but we have clinicians from some of our community wellness programs, some of our specialized clinics that work specifically with our juvenile justice population, as well as our clinicians that support our dually involved youth units. So those youth and child welfare, as well as probation. Really finding time to offer specific one-on-one metric support. I think that's been one of the most helpful insights that we've found. Jessica talked a little bit about this with Fresno County, but just really being able to take some of those cases that people are just feeling really stuck on or complex, or like, where do we start, right? There's so many different pressing needs. And being able to sit down with a clinician together, do a metric, and really look at this really holistic representation of just what's the relational health looking like for this youth and family, what are the needs, how does that then also intertwine with what we're seeing in the CANs, and then more specifically, what are the recommendations from the metric really helping us to highlight, and how do we highlight that to our partners and treatment team. We've been expanding our leadership that's been trained in NMT, and I think as my colleagues have shared earlier, that's just been really, really important to get the leadership buy-in because it trickles down, right? So if the leaders are aware and bought into NMT, then we're talking about it, in team meetings, we're talking about it in department meetings, it's being brought into supervision differently. So that's been really something that we've been trying to really champion in our department. And then lastly, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple other slides, is really thinking about training our partners and how to introduce these concepts throughout our system. So it's not just the behavioral health clinicians that are getting trained in this, but really to create that basic baseline of understanding, because the work really is so much bigger than just the one clinician, that's meeting with that youth. And so we really want those principles to be alive and vibrant in all areas of our system. Next slide, please. You can go to the next one. Thanks. So currently we have 30 folks that are phased and trained one. We've had an additional 15 that have been trained. So we've had about 45 total folks trained in phase one with our 4 different cohorts. But due to attrition, folks leaving the county, changing positions, we have 30 that are currently within our programs right now. We have 3 trainers. So that's another kind of lesson learned, is really making sure you have the bandwidth to have folks to be able to do the training because it is quite a commitment. And then we have our mentor, phase 3 certified Rachel, both that is really kind of the champion of bringing this to our county system. This data I think is a little outdated. We've had more than 542 metrics done, but just some numbers of where we currently are. Next slide, please. So I'd love to dive into this really in depth, but I think a lot of these concepts have already been talked about by my colleagues, but we've just learned a lot in this process, and really reflecting on the strengths of NMT and how it's really supported treatment in our juvenile justice setting, as well as some of the challenges that we've learned that we need to navigate. So I talked briefly about just the metrics that we're doing and the ability to be able to really dive in deep to, have the clinicians take an inventory of past experience, current functioning. And what I think we've found most beneficial from the metric portion of this is it really gives a good place to start with the youth, because often, as we've talked about today, many of these youth have just a lot of complex needs. And so it's, where do we start? I think we've helped kind of move some of our system partners in thinking about, like, well, we might not start with trauma-focused CBT, right? We might not start with just talk therapy. We might need to be doing some movement. We might need to really just focus on helping the youth build regulation skills or build relationship. And so it really gives just an ability to, in a framework, to have different conversations that we maybe kind of struggled with bringing those perspectives in the past. The emphasis on relationships has just been such a pivotal part of this model, and really helping identify the relational health needs of the youth, the strengths that they have, bringing those folks in through the CFT process, and then how do we grow and maintain it. And one of the, I think, successes, but also challenges that we found with implementing this in the juvenile justice setting is, while they're in this program, they're in a contained environment. It's very routine. It's very scheduled. They really know what to expect. And in some ways that actually can be somewhat regulating. But then what we've seen is, once we've been able to maybe make some progress on some of these areas, it's that transition then back into the community. So how are we bringing the family into these conversations? How are we connecting them with resources that are going to support this once they transition from the facility? So that's been both a success as well as a challenge that we've tried to navigate. And then I'll just speak really briefly on the piece around the relevant interventions. Tony did a beautiful job of really talking about that earlier, but that has been I think, such an important concept in this training, because it's really promoting just finding these interventions that are specific to meet the youth where they're at, right? And so many caregivers, so many system partners, even us as, the clinicians working with them can be really frustrated when, we're expecting youth to perform at their chronological age, or we're trying to do an intervention that we're like, why aren't they engaging in this, right? But really thinking about what are the developmental needs, and it's a strength, but also a challenge, and then helping our partners also kind of understand why we're looking at things in this kind of relevant way, to really look at the developmental needs of each youth. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Thanks. So this is just really early initial data. It's this pretty small sample because really trying to refine our outcomes and data collection. But we included it in here because what we really want to just share is that it's giving us some good feedback and really helping us to reflect on that implement. And then also notable reductions in impulsive behavior and their arousal continuum needs. We're also seeing, when we're looking at kind of the early metrics compared to the later metrics that we're doing on this youth, that youth are having better empathy, increases in communication skill, including better skills around conflict resolution. And so what we really like about this idea of the pre and post, but that's not necessarily what we call it, but kind of the initial metric and then doing another metric, 6-9 months later, is it helps give the language to talk to the youth about different therapeutic interventions. It gives us language to talk to the partners and family members about some of the progress and some of the recommendations that we might want to be considering. And then really thinking about, okay, so we're seeing this change in this highly structured environment, but what do we need to do then to maintain that once transitioning out? Next slide. So again, feels like we've been doing this forever, but I have to remind myself almost on a weekly basis, we're still really early into our implementation. One of the takeaways that has been extremely helpful has been collaborating with other system partners. So I've been very grateful to have Cindy from San Mateo just be a wonderful resource to learn from her county. It's been great to get to know Jessica and Jose to kind of understand how Fresno's implementing it. So I think that's one of my pitches that I would suggest for all of us together is how do we really think about how this works in our own settings and learn from each other. We started really big. We did a cohort every year. So again, really thinking about a more mindful approach, training folks, but then also how do we sustain it? And then how do we really help give some of these concepts and psychoeducation around this model to our system partners. And that's something we've been starting to do is we're really looking at expanding NMT to other areas in our department. We've been kind of adding little doses of NMT into implementation meetings, cross-system meetings with partners, and currently thinking about just a wider plan to bring this out. Do the next slide, and then I'll just hand it over to Cindy. So again, I've already kind of talked about these pieces. The one last thing I'll say is that we are really looking at number 4, how to build out a program evaluation component, because we really want to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of this clinical work. And while the early data is promising, really thinking about like how do we gather this on a more consistent basis so that it not only strengthens the message of and the benefit of NMT, but also helps the clinicians feel like the metrics are supporting their work and feeling more efficient in their use of it. So sorry, I totally sped through that, but I'm going to pass it over to Cindy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle and Cindy. Really quick before you get started, we are going to go ahead and drop our evaluation now during this last 7 minutes of our webinar. So please, folks, as you are listening to Cindy's presentation, go ahead and take a moment to complete that evaluation for us. We do greatly appreciate your feedback. And with that, Cindy, come on in. Welcome.
Well, thank you, everyone. And don't worry, I will be speaking primarily to the funding piece. I saw some questions around funding and just implementing a change of practice. So I won't probably go through all our slides. The slides are there for you all just to have information as to how our county did it. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Tony spoke to this already, and so this is going to pertain more to what I speak about, is how we secured funding to really close some gaps for children and youth who had complex care needs. So next slide. We have served well over 400 children. This is probably very old, and it's just hard to access some of this data. And over time, we started this in 2012. We've trained over 63 staff. We have about 14 trainers. And I think the important thing about this piece is that one of the things about neurosequential is that it allows you to also go to that phase 2 training to train trainers and just continue the training in-house. So while we have staff that have left over the years, we continue to be able to train more and more staff that allows us to continue our program. I'm currently in the phase 3 mentoring, which will allow us to continue to train more trainers as well. Now, one of the things that Tony did, and I just want to reference Tony, who spoke extensively in the beginning about changing practice, because when she spoke, she did speak about San Mateo County. This is where she got her start. And so Tony initially secured funding from the Millionaire Tax, which at the time was called Measure A funding, which became Measure K, which then transitioned into MHSA, which I know will be changing to BHSA in 2026. The new fiscal year. So we'll see how that changes things. But she was able to secure, initially $600,000 and then another $200,000 more for our adult system. So we've implemented NMT in our adult system, which I won't speak on today. That is a completely different animal in and of itself. But she secured this funding, and I'm going to talk a little bit as to why it was needed in a few slides. But go ahead and go to the next one. I'm just going to call attention to our timeline here. We started, like I said, in 2012. So we are at 7 cohorts of training people already. We just wrapped up our 7th cohort. But I was trained in 2012, but my position as the program specialist overseeing this didn't come in until 2018. And I think it's really important to speak to that, because if we're going to dedicate time and if we really want to change practice, we need to dedicate the funding for it and really build in positions for this. And, for those of you that maybe are able to speak to higher ups in the state, I think this is really important to speak to. So this is here for your information. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Briefly, I'll just say, when right before 2012 hit, Tony was asked to actually review a case of a young adult who was having a lot of difficulties with a lot of violent and aggressive behaviors towards staff at our medical center. I believe it was in psychiatric care. And they asked Tony to really review this chart. And what she saw is that from childhood, this young adult had touched so many parts of our system and fell through the cracks. And at the same time that she was reviewing his chart, she got to hear Dr. Perry come and speak at one of our organizations. And she felt that, we have to do something different. We have to change practice, and we have to change the way that we see trauma. And I think at that time, we were just beginning to see trauma and to take it into consideration and into account as to what it meant in how our youth and children manifested behaviors, and to get a better understanding as to what had happened to them. And so this is where it got started. She said, there's no way we can keep doing what we are doing. Things need to change. So next slide. So what we knew we had to do was, change the way that we trained our clinicians, our contracted providers, and our partners, and not just training them in how to do the NMT assessment, but really understanding that we needed to change the way that we viewed trauma behaviors, change the way that we viewed development, get a really good understanding as to how the brain gets impacted through trauma. So next slide. That got us into developing training. Go ahead and click the next one so we could just see both trainings. Tony actually developed something called the 6-Core Strength Series, and it was based off Dr. Perry's series. And so if you see here, it looks at a sequential development of capacities This training is open to all providers, to caregivers, to foster parents, CFS workers, probation, education, because you don't need to be a clinician to understand all of these principles. And then there's the phase one, which is to support clinicians to understand how to do the assessment. So this is kind of how we decided we're going to change practice by providing better supports and better training. And I know that we are at 11 o'clock. So Jessica, I don't know where you want to take it. If you want me to keep going for the sake of recording while people come off, it's up to you. But I just want to say, I think Tony spoke to a lot of the foundation. The other systems are speaking to how they're getting it started. We are much more ahead. And I think in the terms of like having implemented it, but I think what I want to say is the same aspects of what we learned, the mistakes we made apply across the board. So what you learn from the other two programs is in some ways very valuable if you're just starting. What I just want you to take away from my training is focus on gathering through MHSA funding, through BHSA, the funding that it needs to really support our youth with this. So Jessica, I'll let you take over at this point.
Oh, thank you so much, Cindy. And I just want to say we do have a few moments if there was anything specific you wanted to mention or bring up. From here, we would just be asking folks if they have any questions or comments. You can put your question in the chat or use the raise your hand feature. I do see one question I'm interested in asking the group before we close. But again, Cindy, I just want to give you a moment to collect your thoughts and see if there's anything else you wanted to say.
Great. I just want to point out the next slide, which is where we focused our funding. So when we talk about equity, this is what we were saying is that we have children who have experienced severe adversity early on, and we know that they're not getting the support they need through their IEPs, if they even get to an IEP. They're not getting the supports that they need or they weren't getting the supports that they needed in other placements, right? And so I wanna say that what Tony did is she built out these contracts for children and families who just normally wouldn't have access to these types of treatments and interventions: speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, trauma-informed yoga providers, equine therapy. And so when we do NMT assessments on children and youth, we decide if, they really are delayed in development because of neglect, because of trauma, and we want to help them access, or get back on that developmental trajectory. And we do so by connecting them to different contracts that, again, they wouldn't have probably the capacity to do otherwise, that maybe their school systems don't even have the capacity to connect them. So these are the contracts. We also use flex funds, which is a different pot of money where we can provide supports to connect children to community-based resources, again, with the idea in mind that we're trying to build out their relational supports as well. So this information is here for you. This is kind of how we utilize our funding to support our youth. I do think there was a question around the cultural pieces. We primarily in San Mateo County serve a Latino monolingual Spanish-speaking population. So we are also trying to make interventions relevant, and that includes cultural relevance. We want to make sure that our speech and occupational therapy contracts have Spanish-speaking providers or that can provide translation services as needed. But we do keep that in mind, especially for flex funds when we connect to other resources in the community. And again, not just to our Latino monolingual Spanish population, but to other, we serve a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds. So we do keep that in mind when we look at interventions, because culture is important to our families.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Cindy. And also thank to all of our other presenters today, Jessica, Michelle, Rachel, Tony. Thank you all for being here with us and helping to share out this valuable information. I'm going to answer one or get to one question that's in the chat, and thank you for answering that question, Cindy, about culture. So the other question was specifically for Cindy. You mentioned the Core Strength series is available to families, foster parents, etc. Is this something that is only available within your service area?
Yes, it's what we do to train and to start just bringing in the language of NMT and the idea of how, adversity, neglect, but also supportive, protective factors impact the developing brain. But I do want to call attention that Dr. Perry has created a foundational training that is on the neurosequential site. So I think it mirrors this, and that's something that he just came out with. If you want to just kind of support your own county in bringing in like an introduction to the neurosequential model.
Well, thank you for adding that. That is great to know. I also am going to go ahead and drop the link for Dr. Bruce Perry's complex care webinar he did for us in 2023. So if you are interested in viewing that webinar, you can do so through that link there. And with that, we are basically at time. So thank you all for staying on a few minutes longer. I will share the Resource Center for Family Focused Practice email in the chat right now. If you have any follow-up questions, please let us know. And as well, the contacts for our presenters are available in the slide deck. So once again, that slide deck and the recording of today's presentation will be made available on our website in a few days. So keep an eye out for that. And with that being said, once again, thank you all for being here with us on this Wednesday morning. It's really wonderful to see so many folks in the room. And I really just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you to all of the presenters today. You all did a great job and you're doing really great work out there. So that's it for us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Take care. We'll see you next month.